Thank you all for being here. My name is Carly Smith. I work with the Foundation for California Community Colleges, and I help lead the California Community Colleges Health and Wellness Program in partnership with the Chancellor's Office. And we're very excited to bring to you throughout the next 5 or 6 weeks a series of training focused on mental health needs and resources for communities throughout our system, throughout our state. And I'm very excited today to be able to partner with Esther. So Esther Villegas Sandoval is here to share with us her knowledge and wisdom. And she's from College of the Canyons, which is excellent to have you here. So thank you. If you're interested in learning about the other trainings that are coming up over the next few weeks, please feel free to email me directly, or you can email wellness@foundationccc.org, and I can make sure you get the upcoming trainings. And I will put both my email and the wellness email in the chat box. But with that, I know we have a lot to go over today with a short amount of time. And so I am going to turn it over to you, Esther. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carly. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Today, we're definitely going to go on a bit of a journey. We're going to have a few pit stops and discuss different themes and topics. So I hope you have your tea, your coffee, your water, or something else that cannot be disclosed. Whatever you need to go ahead and power through the next hour and a half. The presentation will probably last about an hour 10, 15 minutes. And then we'll have a Q&A session where you can just share your own knowledge and your own experiences, because the reality is that there is such a wealth of knowledge sitting here in this webinar. I saw someone doing their thesis on the experiences of undocumented college students, which is amazing. That's what I did my thesis on when I was in grad school. And there's a lot of mental health counselors. So I know that there's a lot of experts and resources in this webinar. So today's webinar is Trauma-Informed Practices to Best Support College Student Success. We're going to be exploring some of those trauma-informed practices that we can do to best serve our students. So a little bit about myself. My name is Esther Villegas Sandoval. As you can see in this Zoom little tag that I have, I am a sociology professor at College of the Canyons. I have dedicated my research to better understanding the experiences of undocumented youth and undocumented students, particularly as they pursue post-secondary education. I also have a background in special education in supporting students with developmental disabilities. And both this experience and this research has propelled me forward to explore universal design and trauma-informed practices. So we make sure that we are establishing equitable classroom and office practices. So we are going to be discussing trauma today, and I want to remind you to honor your boundaries and your well-being. If something is making you feel uncomfortable, or it's making you feel like you're disassociating, disengaging, zoning out, it's just not sitting well with your soul, please feel free to step away, close the webinar, or maybe engage in some other practices that can bring you back to the present. So if you're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, maybe think about humming, taking a pause, engaging in slow breathing, which is something I did before this webinar, maybe rocking yourself, smelling something. I usually have essential oils at my desk. So if I'm feeling a little stressed, I can, just have a scent that's going to bring me back to the present moment. You can also engage in some energy release, rubbing your hands, shaking out, anything that's going to feel good for you. Now, today's session is not a perfect recipe to follow. Really, today's session should be a point of departure for personal reflection and also personal conversation, to really reflect on your practice, to reflect on your pedagogy, on your classroom structure, on your assignments, on the way that you interact with your students, and to ask yourself, am I embedding trauma-informed practices? Do I have a trauma-informed pedagogy? In today's session, we are not romanticizing trauma. Trauma ultimately can and does impact the way that individuals function, and that is what we have to honor, the work that we need to do to make sure that our students feel safe. today we are going to build compassion and understanding towards others, and maybe also towards ourselves, because perhaps those of us that are sitting here in this webinar, we are survivors of trauma. The goal is also to feel empowered and feel a sense of agency and knowing what we can do for others and other individuals who have experienced trauma, and also for ourselves. And last but not least, we're going to walk away with being able to understand, identify, and also being able to implement some trauma-informed practices, even if we cannot implement them all. So first and foremost, what in the world are trauma-informed practices? And what are trauma-informed educators? So first and foremost, trauma-informed educators are not mental health professionals. I was looking at the chat and there was a lot of counselors and a lot of therapists, MFTs. Those are your mental health professionals. Trauma-informed educators are educators that understand that trauma exists in our world and others, and also in ourselves. And we are aware that trauma has effects or can have effects. We understand that trauma can impact well-being, that it can impact functioning across settings, and that it can also impact learning. We understand the importance of, and we also take accountability in creating settings where students feel safe, empowered, with it, where they feel connected. That's the goal. We're not providing some kind of mental health intervention. We're creating space for people to feel safe. We're also open to understanding how current and historical systems of power, privilege, and oppression, whether that's racism, sexism, ableism, classism, that those can elicit and impact stress, that can impact experiences, and also set the stage for trauma and or create trauma. One of the things that I also want you to keep in mind is that being trauma informed is not a checkoff list. It's not like we reach this stage and we don't have to do any more work. Being trauma informed is a continuous practice, much like allyship, and it's really a commitment to the students that we serve. So let's give you a roadmap so that we know where we're going today. Again, today is going to be a bit of a journey, and we're taking these pit stops. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about trauma, what it is, what are the different types of trauma. We're going to try to better understand the experiences of undocumented college students, which is a very diverse group. We're also going to discuss what are things that we can do, whether you are, working in an EOPS office, whether you're a professor, whether you're teaching math, English, science. What are things that we can do to implement trauma-informed practices? What does that look like? How can we practice allyship? And how can we foster joy? And also, what are some ways that we can respond to student disclosed trauma in the event that that does happen to you? And what are some strategies for grounding? And then after that, we're going to conclude with the Q&A. And again, you're more than welcome to share information, to correct anything that I got wrong, to ask questions, right? We're here as a community and we're here to learn. Trauma. So trauma results from an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual either as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. So it overwhelms our ability to cope. And that has lasting adverse effects on our functioning, as well as our physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So it's important to know that not all stress becomes trauma. Trauma are those events, those stressful events, those stressful circumstances that somehow impact our functioning and our well-being. Now, there's different types of trauma. We have individual trauma, and we also have community trauma, which we'll be talking about in the next slide. But when we're looking at micro-level trauma, when we're looking at individual trauma, we have acute, chronic, and complex. So acute trauma is that trauma that reflects a one-time traumatic event, like being in a car accident, surviving assault, etc., whether that's sexual robbery, an example like that, or overcoming a natural disaster. We also have chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is trauma that is repetitive and occurs over an extended period of time. such as being growing up in a household where there's addiction and abuse, being exposed to poverty that spans over time and creates that stress and sets the stage for trauma over a period of time. And we also have complex trauma, which is more persistent and it's more impairing. And it's often seen as a product of repeated acute, so several one-time traumatic events or chronic trauma. It's important to know that complex trauma is more invasive, it's more chronic and prolonged, and it can also be more overwhelming, which these experiences are therefore compromising. And it's often within the context of an interpersonal relationship that we have with other individuals. This type of trauma can impact multiple areas of life. So learning, dating, friendships, being able to work, our professional relationships, it can impact multiple areas of life across different domains of functioning. However, trauma does not only impact or hurt individuals, trauma also impacts communities too. The reality is that traumatic events can impact the functioning of the larger group or the larger community, and it can impact the behavior of larger groups and communities. Trauma can lead to cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations. So the reality is that individuals can carry deep wounds from things that happen to a group with which they identify with. So those maybe traumatic experiences didn't happen to them directly, but it did happen to a group that they identify with, a group that they belong, or a group that they associate with. So it's important to know that trauma can impact individuals even when we individually do not have direct exposure to those events. An applicable or relevant example are Armenian families and how they still very much carry the deep wounds from the Armenian genocide that happened in the early 1900s. We also see this kind of trauma with our Asian American Pacific Islander communities, our African American communities, and really all BIPOC communities. We can see that be present. So trauma can also arise from colonization, enslavement, and like I said, genocide, as well as ongoing oppression and ongoing marginalization, where individuals are not given full access to rights, full access to privileges or protection that other citizens are granted and given. So we also have insidious trauma, which is the result from ongoing daily incidents of marginalization, objectification, dehumanization, and intimidation that is experienced by members of groups who are targeted by oppression. So those are individuals who are targeted by racism, that are targeted by heterosexism, ageism, ableism, or sexism. Now, this kind of trauma doesn't need to be and may not be necessarily physically violent in order for it to impact the soul and the spirit of a community. And one of the examples that always comes to mind when I talk about this trauma is our immigrant communities. So years ago, I used to work for a nonprofit organization in the San Fernando Valley, which is in LA County. So if anyone's here from this area, hi there. So I worked for this nonprofit organization that created a ton of programs for children, youth, and adults, anything from tutoring, parenting classes, etc. And we would also host community meetings. Now, our local police department wanted to become involved with us because the area that we service was high crime and there was a lot of gang violence. But individuals would not cooperate with LAPD and particularly that office because they didn't feel like they could trust them. And so LAPD had this really vested interest in forging a relationship with our nonprofit organization to get credibility so that they could establish a relationship with our community, which were largely immigrants, so that they can report crimes, they can assist them when they were exploring crimes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that the local LAPD office did, which really hurt their efforts and really hurt their ability to build a bond with our community, were redadas. And I know autocorrect is probably going to forget about that. Redadas are, checkpoints, stop points. And they would often do these checkpoints on the weekends when our office would be closed. And so typically what would happen is they would do some kind of checkpoints. They would, essentially really be harassing the community. And on Mondays, when I would go in and open the center, because I was the program coordinator who oversaw all the programs, I would have individuals who come into my office and, they would say, Esther, you won't believe what happened. And I will never forget, there was a couple that I often worked with. And the wife and the husband come in one day, and the husband was just so distraught. Like, you could see that he was like defeated, brokenhearted. You could just see that there was such a loss of hope in his face. And his wife started telling me that the truck was already somehow parked in the streets. They checked for his driver's license because I believe he had a Virgin Mary carried in the rearview mirror. And as soon as they realized that he didn't have a driver's license, which this happened before California allowed undocumented immigrants to have licenses here in California. So they went ahead and they asked him for his license, even though the car was already parked, he wasn't driving. And when they realized that he didn't have a license, they impounded his vehicle. And I will never forget what, he told me. He said, it doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter how hard I work. Nothing is ever really mine. It doesn't matter how hard I work. Anything and everything could be taken away from me. And that's what is insidious trauma, right? It's a breaking of the spirit that occurs from that ongoing intimidation. And it wasn't physical, right? The law enforcement officers weren't, engaging in a necessary brutality or force, but it was still impacting the well-being of those individuals, their perspectives, and also the well-being and the functioning of the community. Because then we had to change behavior in which the community didn't have that relationship with local law enforcement because they themselves entirely became fearful of their interactions with law enforcement. So we just didn't see avoidance in individuals. We began to see avoidance and continued avoidance by the entire group. But of course, this is also relevant with what's been going on with the increased hate crimes against our Asian American, Pacific Islander communities, of course, the ongoing violence against our African American and Black communities, and so forth. Now, in switching gears, so I know that there's a lot of therapists on this webinar, and you know this, and you probably would be able to dive into this a little bit more than I can. But a lot of you sitting in this webinar know that trauma can impact multiple areas of our lives. Trauma can impact cognitive and emotional growth. It can result in cognitive delays, learning and behavior impairments, anxiety, depression, attention difficulties, which obviously will impact learning. It can create disrupted attachment process. Essentially, individuals will excessively seek help, or they will be incredibly independent and isolated. Trauma can also lead to disassociation. So that means like zoning out, shutting down, not being emotionally present, even when someone is physically present. It can also lead to impulsive behavior, individuals being hyper alert, scanning essentially the environment for danger, or being hyper aroused. When we are hyper aroused, we quickly react to things that other people would consider not threatening. So maybe like a door slamming, right? Or like something being dropped on the ground. So what typically are considered non-threatening cues, individuals respond to. It can also create difficulty in processing information, memory, whether that's retaining information or recalling information, two separate things. Our ability to interact positively with others, our ability to identify and regulate emotions, and our ability to use serotonin, and also our ability to develop executive functioning skills, which are so important for individuals to get tasks done, right? To be able to succeed in our classrooms, and also succeed in our campuses, being able to accomplish tasks. And it can really also set the stage for PTSD, which is a disorder in which symptoms after trauma, like avoidant behavior, flashbacks, nightmares, where they don't resolve after a traumatic event. So not all stress will lead to trauma, and not all trauma will lead to PTSD. There we go. So students who have experienced trauma may do a couple of things in our classrooms. And it's so important for us as professors, as staff, as college employees, to be able to understand these signs. So oftentimes our students are not difficult. So often our students are not lazy. There are times where our students are just simply survivors of trauma. It has nothing to do with their motivation. Sometimes their behavior is just a byproduct of traumatic experiences. So some of the behavior that we can see in our classrooms and on our campuses may be that students are unable to control their emotions and have frequent outbursts. On the other side of the spectrum, we can also see individuals be very quiet or submissive. Not all trauma leads to anger. We can also see individuals be incredibly submissive after they've experienced trauma. So it's important for us to understand that there could be a spectrum of experiences. Individuals, our students, can also have difficulties in learning in school, again, because they have a challenging time retaining information, recalling information, or even just paying attention because they're scanning for danger, or they're responding to these non-threatening cues that happen in a classroom, like the air conditioner kicking on, etc. They can also have difficulties getting along with others, and have a difficult time responding to affection or care, such as your praise, or our praise. They can also have unusual eating or sleeping behaviors. They can sometimes attempt to provoke fights or also appear oppositional and or solicit sexual experiences, and in general be socially or emotionally inappropriate for their age. So if we see a pattern of behaviors, I highly encourage you to develop relationships with your mental health counselors on campus and lean on them for support, which is something that I'm going to talk about later on in the presentation. It is so important that we identify services on campus and key players to know who are the individuals that we can lean on, who can we email for help, especially when we see a pattern of behaviors. I will also encourage that if you see an individual, a student, engage in certain behavior, take notes so that you can provide a more well-rounded, story to whoever it is that you're seeking for help. And obviously, you're going to keep this confidential, and you're only going to speak about it with the individuals that are appropriate. Now, trauma can also impact the body, and it can have effects on the body. I oftentimes tell my students that our bodies speak for us. Sometimes when we don't want to acknowledge how we're feeling, the body will speak for us. So there can be somatic symptoms, which essentially are bodily symptoms or dysfunctions that essentially express emotional distress, like headaches, dizziness, fainting, pain, even constipation. So trauma can be related to various disorders like gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, neurological, musculoskeletal, respiratory, dermatological, urological, and then substance use disorders. Now, I say this because if we have students that are perhaps saying, my head always hurts, or I don't feel well, or, I constantly have to go to the restroom, during class time. Again, we can't take that personal. We're not going to assume that it's trauma. We just have to kind of take a step back and realize that we don't know what's happening in the lives of our students. And we may want to build a relationship with students. And if they constantly, bring these concerns of not feeling well, then maybe we can gently say, oh, I encourage you to visit our, student health and wellness centers, right? And see if maybe you want to have a conversation with that. About that with someone. Now, there are a few students population at risk, and I'm actually going to ask for the chat here. So let me find this chat. Oh no, I think I have to wait. So I want you to answer this question, and I'm actually going to annotate it here. What are some student populations that may be at risk for traumatic experiences? I want you to enter that in the chat. Question to answer in the chat. Ooh, look at me, I can't type. And I'm gonna go ahead and look at the chat for just a second. me see. Veterans, students with disabilities, yes. Black, undocumented, homeless, low socioeconomic status, LGBT, foster youth, yes. Unaccompanied youth, AB 540, students of colors, absolutely. Yes. Conflict, prone families, everyone. Tracy. So many more thoughts. Yeah. There are definitely some. So thank you for participating. Very much appreciate it. Yes. Okay. So let me go ahead and close this, annotate this off, and then move forward. Yeah, absolutely. You nailed it. There's a lot of student populations that are at risk. The most commonly thought of are students exposed to addiction, so like substance abuse, family abuse, students exposed to economic stress, so poverty, food insecurity, with inconsistent housing. Clearly, students with developmental disabilities can be at much more higher risk for bullying. Of course, military and veteran students, but also children of military and veteran parents. And then, of course, homeless and LGBTQI community. Now, I think one population that often doesn't make the list traditionally when, the National Institute of Health releases these lists is that of undocumented students. And absolutely, they absolutely deserve a spot here for us to be more mindful of their experiences. And the next section, the part 2, if you will, of this presentation is going to talk about their experiences. All right, so better understanding undocumented youth and college students. So first and foremost, we have to understand that undocumented students are not a homogenized group. There are so many complexities that exist. There's diversity in their racial and ethnic background. We have Black, European, undocumented students. There's diversity in their socioeconomic status. Some may not be low income, depending if they come from a mixed status structure, where maybe the parents or some kind of siblings have legal authorization to live and work in the United States. There's also diversity in the age of arrival, whether they come when they're newborns, whether they come when they're 17 or 18, 19, 20, which can also impact the fluency in English and also assimilation and accommodation. There's also diversity in parents' education levels, their ability to pass, which also has to do with their fluency in English. There's diversity in how comfortable they are with disclosing their status, right? Do they come out? Do they not? Do they withhold information? And if there's a lot of things I want you to take away from this presentation, but this is a key point that I want you to take away. Not all undocumented students call themselves dreamers. One of the things that I often find in my colleagues is that they use this label, this like all-encompassing label to label and identify all undocumented students. And we cannot do this. There are so many of our undocumented students who do not connect with the dreamer label for various reasons. The most often that I hear is that they feel like that dreamer label upholds this narrative of who is worthy of a pathway to citizenship and who is not. So we have some undocumented students who use Dreamers and others who don't. Some who use AB 540 because they feel like AB 540 can give them a bit of anonymity, because not everyone who is undocumented is AB 540. Some just identify with the larger undocumented label, but it's so important that we do not assume that we know what label they want to use. There's also diversity to the extent in which they identify with the broader immigrant community. I've interviewed students who absolutely distance themselves from the immigrant community, right? They say that they are undocumented Americans and they consciously create a separation between themselves and the broader immigrant community. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have, undocumented youth and students who just fully believe that they are included, they associate, they see themselves, that immigrant community. There's also diversity with emotions. Yes, there's discomfort, pain, shame, sometimes even anger towards parents, towards themselves, towards the larger society, the system. and anxiety and depression and isolation, and even concern for suicide ideation, which we need to be very mindful. But there's also a lot of resiliency and hope and joy, and there's a whole ton of empowerment, and there's a whole ton of innovation out there. And so we have to understand that there is this diversity in the spectrum of experiences. And there's also a diversity in how people experience fear, which I'll get to in another slide. So disclosure is the act of giving someone secret or new information, and it really entails revealing such information and making it known. Now, the undocumented community is not the only community that engages in disclosure, right? They are not the only community that feels that there is secret information that might be best kept to themselves. Our students with invisible disabilities might need to engage in disclosure, LGBT, homeless, right? There are entire populations who also engage in disclosure. It's important to keep in mind that disclosure can be beneficial and it can also be problematic, which actually answer in the chat right now. What might constrain our undocumented youth from coming out? If a few of you can, quickly put that in the chat. But what might hold back undocumented students from disclosing their status? Fear, definitely. Fear of what? Fear of deportation? Yes, absolutely. Fear of deportation, fear of slurs? Yes, well, yes. Discrimination? Absolutely. Family? Yes. Yeah. So I'll tell you a story. We might need more than an hour and a half, but I'm just kidding. We will end. So I've interviewed a lot of students in the past 10 years. And one of the students that I interviewed, she said that she came out to some of her high school friends because she just didn't want to bear that information alone. She wanted to find a group that she could connect with because she thought that she would be supported. And instead, her own friends started making fun of her. They told her, Addie, don't worry if you can't go to college. You can always sell oranges in the corner. This is where grounding is really good. So hold on to something if this is making you uncomfortable or angry. I know this helped me when I listened to stories. She was even told, is this why you're really good at PE? Because you climbed the wall to be here? And she said, and I asked her, I said, Adeline, how did that make you feel? Did you feel sad? And she said, no. She said, if anything, it just made me realize that I can't tell other people really who I am or a part of who I am. So we have to understand that I've sat with counselors and some counselors say, why can't they just tell us? Because there's fear. And sometimes it's not that they don't trust you or us. It's sometimes that they don't trust the larger setting. Right? It's not necessarily that they don't trust us. They're concerned about the consequences of coming out, specifically in a public space. So that's to keep in mind. Now, similar to our LGBTQI plus communities, our undocumented students also come out. And that really means that they reveal their undocumented status. And oftentimes being undocumented can feel like a secret, like a burden that they're carrying. So what we see is that our undocumented youth, they come out when they feel like coming out will work in their favor. So typically coming out is a very cautious choice. That's a product of a risk benefit analysis where the cost and the benefits, are examined. And when they feel like disclosure will work in their favor, when it will give them access to resources, they do it. And when they feel like it might come at a cost, right, they will withhold that information. So it's important for me to note that sometimes who we come out, we also come out to ourselves, right? Sometimes we have to accept that, we hold these statuses, that we have a disability, that we have a disorder, that we're undocumented, that we have an illness. So oftentimes we don't only tell others who we are, we also tell ourselves who we are. So we also sometimes have to come to terms with the fact that, we hold certain statuses. But a reminder that our statuses do not define us. Our statuses are just a part of who we are. And the reality is that our identity is made up of a ton of statuses and a ton of our personality traits and our characteristics and our behaviors that uniquely make us who we are. And again, this is just an image to show you the different narratives that individuals can, you know, really associate with. Some individuals might really hold on and associate with that undocumented American slash dreamer labels, and others are going to blur the binaries, blur lines, and say, you know what, on stolen land, no one can be undocumented, no one can be illegal on stolen land. So it's important for us to keep in mind that there's such a diversity in experiences. Now, one of the reasons why, you know, individuals do not engage in disclosure and do not come out is because many children are told by their parents that they need to conceal their undocumented status, or if they are going to come out, they really need to be careful about who it is they come out to. Now, I forgot to put this in the slide, but it's also important for us to note that some undocumented youth, and you can go ahead and put this in the chat if you know this, or you know, if you've experienced this, but some undocumented youth do not know that they're undocumented. There are some undocumented youth who do not learn from their parents or their caregivers that they're undocumented until they're adult or until they emerge into adulthood. So for some individuals, they're not consciously, you know, choosing to withhold information. They just, you know, they're not even aware that they're undocumented. I've interviewed students who've told me, I found out I was undocumented the day I tried to fill out FAFSA, or I found out I was undocumented, you know, when I tried to get my driver's license. So there's such a diversity in stories. So undocumented students, beyond having that concern with parents, undocumented students also confront stigmas and stereotypes of being, you know, job takers and criminals and, you know, drainers of, you know, the system and abusers of the system. So that can also make them feel like outsiders, who cannot disclose their true identity. And all of this awareness of stigmas and stereotypes can create fear. But fear is interesting, okay? And you can also write this in the chat. For some of us, fear holds us back, right? We experience fear and we say, oh no, I'm not going to do that. But some of us are not like that. Some of us, some of you experience fear, and fear actually lights a light under your butt. And because you feel afraid, you're like, no, I'm especially going to do it because I am afraid. Does anyone in the chat want to say, yes, that's me? Fear propels me. Fear doesn't constrain me, right? Fear pushes me forward. That's me. Thank you. So for some individuals, so fear again is complex. For some people, it's going to constrain. For others, it's going to enable. For some, it's going to do both, and it's just going to depend on the setting. So coming out can be a way of overcoming and rejecting fear. There's been so many times when I've interviewed undocumented students, and they have told me that being undocumented feels like they are perpetually stuck in childhood, because being undocumented means that there's restrictions about, you know, traveling, you know, the internships that you can apply to, sometimes even the financial aid you can qualify for. So there's a lot of red tape, you know, sometimes when you're undocumented, and that's also going to impact depending on what state you live in, etc. And for some individuals, overcoming fear actually reintroduces power, right? For some people, overcoming fear gives individuals a sense of agency or control that being undocumented seems to take away. But it's also important to note that the bigger reality is that living with fear can actually be very fluid. And I think for most of us, it is very fluid. Fear is a spectrum. It's not like we have this linear, you know, progress to fear. And then when we reach the point of being unafraid, we never are afraid again, right? The reality is that we move in the spectrum. We become unafraid, and then we can go back to being afraid, depending on the setting, depending on who's around. You know, we can have moments and days of fear, and then move forward, and then, you know, be less afraid, or not be afraid the next day. All right. Now, regardless of, you know, the labels that our undocumented students identify with, regardless of their experiences with fear, disclosure, at what age they were notified that they were undocumented, etc. The one thing that binds undocumented students and immigrants together is their liminal legality. It's the fact that they have limited protection to social resources and benefits that exist in our society. And the COVID pandemic has been, unfortunately, this perfect example where when the federal government has released aid to our college students, and this is where our financial aid people can, can jump in, right? What happened? Did we get any red tapes around the economic release to our college students? The answer is going to be yes, right? So we see that there are these limited access to resources. So shared vulnerabilities can be limited access or inability to work legally, seek internships, travel, limited access to financial aid, risk of deportations for self and others, harassment, bullying, discrimination. Again, limited federal and state help during COVID, whether individuals qualify for a stimulus check or not, assimilation, language acquisition, and sadly, limited ability to access and identify informed and supportive school staff. So it's really our responsibility, the responsibility of administrators, the responsibility of colleges, the responsibility of of us as individuals to become informed as to the resources that are there for our special populations. And what services are on campus can we connect our students to? Now, undocumented students can experience stressors and trauma. And this can happen really like in 3 time zones: pre-migration, in journey, and also post-migration. And we're going to start off with the pre-migration, but again, think about it as in this three time zones. And if something becomes stressful for you, again, honor your boundaries, disengage, take a breath, move, stand up, hold on to something in your hands. Do whatever you need to do to maintain that well-being in your soul. So pre-migration stressors really depend on the individual's socioeconomic status before their migration, and also very much depends on their country of origin. Whereas their country of origin, experiencing war or, a natural disaster, and even the specific area within the country. So specific stressors can include political climate, and particularly a turbulent political climate, extreme poverty, crime, violence, physical and sexual assault, abuse, war, civil unrest, and disasters, whether those are natural or whether those are human-made disasters. Now, with in-journey stressors can have long-lasting impacts. And the exposure and also the byproduct of these traumatic events and stressors are impacted largely but by how an individual came to the United States, right? What were the means of travel? Did they find a visa that they overstayed and they hopped on a plane? That might produce less trauma. That might have been less stressful. Something that might be more stressful would be, coming to the United States or the US-Mexico border through La Bestia, which is this train that runs through Mexico and can be used by our Central American immigrants as a way of traversing Mexico, traveling through Mexico, and ending at the US-Mexico border. La Bestia can be one of the most traumatic, if not the most traumatic, way to come to the United States. There is a film that shows this mode of transportation, La Bestia. It is incredibly heartbreaking. It is incredibly eye-opening, saddening, impactful. I don't ever show this film in my classes because it overwhelms my own ability to cope. The one thing that I want to say is this: if you're a professor and you want to show this film, you need to be really prepared. It's a very difficult film to watch. But there's another there's another note that I want to make. There's another point that I want to make. And it's that we should not, and this is just my opinion, we should not have to witness someone suffering in order for us to validate. And I'm going to say that again. But we should not have to witness someone suffering in order for us to validate. We should take their trauma, their stress, their suffering. We should validate it at face value. We should understand that. So that's that. But if you are interested in this film, you can go ahead and watch it and rent it. But people can report on their journey to the United States and this in-journey experience. They can experience physical and emotional trauma, being physically, sexually assaulted, robbed, sustaining physical injuries, having little to no access to food or water, which, puts individuals at risk for dehydration, malnourishment from long periods of traveling, specifically through arid terrains, the risk of drowning. I mean, there's so many things that can happen. And we have to keep in mind that individuals are, dealing with all of this while avoiding detection from government officials. And then we also have post-migration stressors, which a whole long list too. Culture shock, differences in language, use of currency, norms, and even weather, feeling unwelcomed, unwanted, recognizing biases and stigmas that are, all over social media, witnessing violence and discrimination against immigrants in the United States, like knowing that street vendors, get assaulted in their everyday efforts to work. Immigrants can feel like violence is a real part of their daily experiences, even if they don't experience it directly, because again, it's that insidious trauma, right? It's happening to a group that they identify with. It's happening to their in-group, to their communities. Of course, anti-immigration policies like the cancellation of TPS, and then of course, interception and ICE detention centers, which are known to be hostile, often extremely cold, overcrowded, with limited access to resources like restrooms, medical care, food, water. And then of course, our youth entering foster care, which, talk about complex trauma, the trauma of foster care and maybe a difficult in-journey experience, which, can also lead to abuse and exploitation. And then, of course, discrimination related to race and ethnicity, limited English language proficiency, having an accent, cultural differences. And then specific to children and youth, also being adultified. So adultification is this process in which children are given adult responsibilities and roles. And this can also, in some ways, really limit their opportunities to engage in just a normal childhood and just being a child and being a kid, like playing. So this can also add stress, this inability to balance a childhood and just like a, childhood life. Now, it's important to know that settlement for some of our immigrants is never accomplished. Settlement is accomplished when people feel like they're fully established and embraced and at ease in their new location. And for some people, that continuous intimidation, marginalization, right? This will prevent individuals from ever entering this settlement stage. Now, exposure to pre-migration, in-journey, and post-migration stressors and trauma can set the stage for PTSD. It can put individuals at risk for PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And very important to know that trauma can impact all areas of a youth's life. Again, their learning, their ability to carry relationship with peers, teachers. And stress can also be compounded for individuals who feel like they were forced to leave. And they may be feeling, maybe dealing with feelings of grief, of loss, even if no one physically died, right? We have to think about what do our students lose when they relocate to a new country, right? Attachments, bonds, relationships, memories, hopes, future dreams, etc. And also, an older age at discrimination can have a greater impact on psychological distress, perhaps because it's more difficult for them to adjust and also just assimilate and adapt to a new situation. And then, of course, language conflicts between youth and parents can also contribute to stress. I had a student who was South Korean who I interviewed years ago, and he would often tell me that he didn't understand Korean. So he would often tell me that he would get really stressed out with interacting with his parents and his community. And he particularly worried about being deported to South Korea. And he would tell me, Esther, if I get deported to South Korea, what am I going to do? I don't even speak the language. I understand it, but there's no way that I can actually speak Korean with another, Korean member. Now, whoops. Last note before we move on to the third part. Individuals who've experienced trauma and stress can also engage in avoidance. Avoidance is a behavior that has been noted in immigrants. Yep, yep, yep. It's believed that avoidance reflects this attempt to cope with certain emotional states that are, experienced distress. It's a developed habit that produces an immediate effect because it removes the stressor to some extent, but does not really offer a long-time solution. So therefore, it's not really useful and it's not beneficial. And we see it as an unhealthy coping mechanism. Now, avoidance, which is this overarching desire to avoid potentially stressful events and our experience, may stem from prior experiences that elicited stress and our desire to just avoid those experiences that we may think just elicit stress. So immigrants may avoid certain things like, making a doctor's appointment. For us, emailing their professors, making an appointment with ELPS, getting in contact with the Dreamers Liaison appointee on campus, right? All of these things that we may think are not such a big deal may be really stressful and daunting to our students. So it's important for us to know, right? If we know that our students can be avoidant and may not be able to carry or have a difficult time in carrying various tasks, then what can we do to maybe make these things less stressful? Or what can we do to bring resources to them if we know that they may not seek our resources because it may be too stressful for them? So something to think about. And then, of course, it's important to know that we might see avoidance in our friends, right? Not only our students, but we might see avoidance in our friends, in our coworkers, and in ourselves. So it might be important to break things down, create a task analysis for yourself, for your partners, for the people that you loved, so that, they can move forward in their task and in their efforts. All right, so we're going to switch gears to part 3. And that is, what do we do, right? Because again, the whole purpose is, what do we do? How can we help others? What can we do in our offices, in our classrooms? So first and foremost, we need to abstain and avoid emotional invalidation, dismissive or toxic positivity, and silver lining. Um, Emotional invalidation are statements or actions that negate experiences and or feelings, okay? That can happen verbally, like, you're making such a big deal out of it, right? Or first world problems. Or it can happen non-verbally. So maybe someone is telling me something and I roll my eyes, I sigh, I walk away, right? Those are all forms of emotional invalidation, okay? Now, chat question. How, for those of you who have experienced emotional invalidation, which is probably most, if not all of us, how has it felt to have someone negate or minimize our experiences of stress? How has it felt when you have disclosed someone to someone, right, like this stressful situation, and their response has been, one where they negate it, or they minimize it, and they're telling you that it's not a big deal? How has that felt? Oh, it's terrible. Makes me feel like my emotions aren't true. Yeah, a little bit of gaslighting. Shuts down, demoralizing and angering, frustration, not heard, let down. Yeah. And it's so important for us to remember that just because something could be worse doesn't mean that it's not bad, right? And we have to remember that just because something is not the absolute worst that could happen it doesn't mean that it's challenging for individuals. And at the end of the day, all we know is our own experiences, right? We really don't have anything else to compare it to. So if something is stressful to us, that's valid, right? It is stressful to us, even if something can be worse. Um, and then, of course, the dismissive positivity, like good vibes only, right? Think positively. Everything's going to work out. Um, Dismissive positivity is a cognitive bias, so it's an inclination, a desire. It's a strategy to avoid painful, unresolved, uncomfortable, and problematic emotions at all cost, right? And it's important to know that individuals may be very well intentioned, right? They might actually be trying to help us, see a different perspective, but they may not be welcome. And then the reality is that they may not be helpful at that time. Individuals themselves need to, find the good in their own circumstances. We are not in a position, and we should not be, and we're not in positions to minimize people's experiences, or even try to find the hope for the good in their situations. Like, well, at least, that's not our position. Okay. So avoid that. Now, with that being said, really quickly, we are all human beings. And sometimes the reality is that I think sometimes we invalidate others also because we're tired, we're drained, maybe we're having a rough day, maybe we're not at, our optimal, functioning. And I think sometimes we do it just because we're tired ourselves. It's so important to know emotionally where you're at. If you're in a position where you cannot provide validation, and it might really be useful to tell someone, you know what, I'm struggling today. Maybe can we chat later? Or I care about you. Why don't you chat with about this to someone else? But sometimes we are not able to respond to individuals, and that's valid. That does not make us bad people. That makes us human when we cannot provide that support. So if you are in a space where you cannot listen to someone, then refer them to someone who can. It's so important for us to be aware of what our budget is really looking like. Is it dipped, or are we good to proceed and help others? Be aware of resources on campus, like the Dreamers Resource Centers, maybe certain task force, committees, alliances, clubs. Be aware of any food pantry services, career service, EOPS. And again, identify those key players on campus. Who's the director of mental health? Who's the director of student services? Who are those individuals that you can email or call when you're having situations arise? I have a very close relationship with the assistant director of our mental health center, our student wellness center. Special shout out to Larry Schallert. I lean on him a lot for certain circumstances when I know that I cannot, provide care to my students, which is often because I'm not a mental health professional. I am a sociology professor. So I lean on certain key players on our campus quite often to make sure that our students are getting the services that they are worthy of and that they deserve. So in terms of mental health, important for us to know that CBT, which is a intervention, is proven to be helpful to our undocumented youth, but it needs to be delivered in their preferred language, and it also has to take account their cultural background. So as long as it's culturally responsive and relevant, it's a great resource. It's a great way to help individuals feel a sense of agency and be able to heal. So again, being aware if we have those services, if you have those services on your campus. Also keep in mind that it's not all bad. Resiliency is innately within us, right? It's innately within our humanity. That possibility for resiliency exists. So many people do find ways, healthy ways to cope with, to respond to heal from their trauma. So they may experience a traumatic event or situation, and they, as a result, may have increased bonding with family and community. They might have an increased sense of purpose and meaning in helping others. They might have an increased commitment to personal mission, to revise priorities. They might be, engaging in charitable giving or volunteerism. So remember that human beings have capacity for resiliency, and so many of us are resilient, right? We're like those little flowers that break through from the snow. We keep going, we keep chugging along. Also keep in mind that there are protective factors that help, specifically our undocumented youth. So going into the research really quickly, Among Latino, Hispanic, and also Asian immigrants, we know that stronger positive and ethnic identities, as well as greater parental closeness, well-functioning family support systems, social support, and high parental responsiveness, we know that these things help protect from trauma. Now, I say this knowing darn well that we are not the family of our students. But here's a question that I'm going to throw in the chat. Can classrooms, can colleges function like families? Yes or no? And if you think, and if you think, yes, we can, I want you to think about what can professors, staff, what can we do that mirrors a family relationship, a supportive? Let me take that back. What can professors and staff do that can mirror a healthy family relationship? Listen, build community, be patient, give unconditional love. Yeah. So we need like unconditional love, I think in college world, I think means accepting our students even when they're failing, right? If our students are failing their classes, we don't turn our back on them, right? We continue to provide them care. That's unconditional care. Our students have a tantrum or, an episode in class, and guess what? The next time we come up and we say, hey, that's not okay. Here are some resources, but you're welcome if it's appropriate. Compassion. Yes, I love this, right? How are they doing? Showing up for students. Yes, being present. Absolutely. So here's the kicker, right? We're technically not family and we shouldn't be families because we need to have professional boundaries. But within our professional boundaries, we can mimic certain behaviors that will allow students to feel pride for who they are. So we should celebrate our students, racial and ethnic backgrounds. We should celebrate their accents and say, you know what, good for you for speaking multiple languages. We can support our students. We can engage in conflict resolution. We can be flexible, right? We can communicate with them. We can provide consistent feedback. We can provide positive feedback. So those are things that we can do. Yes, positive reinforcement. I love that, Sandy. So we can still provide things that are behaviors that are going to mirror those healthy family dynamics while maintaining professional boundaries, which is, where we want to be. We want to be professional, but we want to be supportive. I wish you could have thumbs up so I could get some thumbs up here, but I'm just going to imagine virtual thumbs up in my head. Yes, growth mindset. Love that, Ruben. All right. So here we go to trauma-informed classroom practices, and my time is quickly coming to an end. So professors, let's go. And future professors, let go. So there's a lot of tips and strategies for having a trauma-informed classroom. And honestly, it can be overwhelming because it's a lot. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed. I want you, again, this whole session is a point of departure. It is a beginning to your journey or a continuation of your journey. I want you to think about this when I read the slides. What can I connect to? What jumps at me immediately? And what are some things that maybe I don't like? I need to stick in the back of my brain because I'm not ready. What are some tips I don't feel comfortable with and really need to think about further? And what are some things that I can implement right now? And the reality is that if you are following universal design practices or culturally responsive practices, guess what? You are already doing the good work and you deserve a round of applause and a delicious snack because you're already doing the good work. And chances are, if you're here, you're already doing it some way, somehow, you're already in the spectrum. So first things first, environment. Trauma-informed practices start with the environment that we create for our students, whether it's in a classroom or whether it's in your EOPS office, you name it. We want to create environments that are positive, that are safe, where there's little to no embarrassment. So we're not like picking on our students or even, joking around if we know that they're not comfortable with that. We allow students to feel comfortable, engaged, and supported. There's high support and there's little shame. So I'm notorious for calling on my students But I allow them to pass because I don't want to put pressure on them. I don't want to embarrass them. So you can allow students to pass on discussions. Be trustworthy, be empathetic, and be transparent. So explain why you have certain policies. Keep your word. If you say, I'm going to give you these many points, give them that many points. Um, think about your students. We really have no idea, what their lives are like. Build relationships. So learn people's names, make eye contact. If we ever get back to the classroom, walk around your classroom. Involve students, ask them questions, request feedback. Let them have some control over assignments where they can. Be present, show interest in the lives of your students. So if they tell you that, they like Pokemon or they're sneakerheads, maybe keep that in mind. Again, this is to build relationships. Be flexible with your students. Be aware that there's crowded living conditions and poverty can access resources and abilities. A lot of districts have given students Chromebooks, yeah, for online learning. What are the quality of these Chromebooks and these hotspots? Good quality? Not great. Darn right, Kristen. Yeah, we need to be mindful of that. So our low-income students may be really struggling right now. Don't out someone, whether they're a veteran, they're a single parent, whether they have a learning disability, right? We need to maintain privacy. It's important. And then, of course, encourage students, give them appropriate praise, recognize their areas of strength to boost confidence or competence. I tell every single one of my students that I know they can do better. And I really fundamentally believe that. I believe that they can do better, that I will help them. And it's so important that we tell students that we recognize their strengths and let them know what we can do for them and how specifically they can get better. That we give them like tangible and specific praise and tangible goals and outcomes. Review personal statements, write letters of recommendation, right? All of those things that again build community, build support. Navigate classroom discussions carefully, use humanizing language. Specifically when it comes to our undocumented theme, do not call people illegal. Just don't. You can call them undocumented out of status, but be mindful of the language that you use in the classroom. Promote civic engagement. So FYI, research has shown that our undocumented students who engage in political activism tend to fare off better. They tend to have more resources, more networking, and emotionally speaking, they're less afraid. It's just better for them across various areas of well-being and functioning. So this can foster critical thinking and also critical hope, which critical hope is different than regular hope. Hope is everything's going to be fine. Critical hope is everything's going to be fine, but this is what you need to do, right? It's not blind. Show enthusiasm for the subject matter. Have your students discuss and explore things that spark passion, give them a sense of purpose, joy, create behavioral norms like a community contract. It's okay if you create the foundation and then have your students add on or modify that community contract. Check in with your students, maybe pull them aside, maybe watch a movie one day and like pull each student aside and just check in on them. How are you doing? What are you struggling with? Send emails. Genuinely value student input, feedback, show appreciation. Design your courses for learning and not compliance. Allow things to be messy. Embrace mistakes and don't shame yourself or others. I know that I have made so many mistakes when I'm teaching, and I just kind of laugh about it because we're all human. And teaching suggestions. Provide content, information in advance. Establish a routine. This helps a lot of students, especially those that thrive off predictability. Review or outline what's going to be accomplished either in the session or in the course, right? Provide your own roadmap for what's going to happen. Tell stories that relate to the subject. This can allow students to learn. Establish really clear rules and regulations. When you teach using multiple modalities. So do lectures, videos, PowerPoints. This can allow individuals to interact with the content in more than one way. And then when asking questions, make sure that you give sufficient time. Remember that trauma as well as learning disabilities can impact processing and processing time. So some students may not be able to provide an answer within that normal like 3 to 5 second range. Some students may have a delay, may need 10, 15, 60 seconds, and be aware of that and be flexible. Suggestions for assignments, obviously give choices where you can. Give disclaimers if you know that something is going to be potentially distressing and difficult, and be prepared to give alternative assignments. Outline assignments for clarification, schedule different types of assignments, make a list of what's expected and what should be accomplished. Essentially, provide a lot of visual breakdown. If possible, provide samples of work and assignments. I've been preaching this for years, and sometimes I'll get professors who say, you're spoon feeding your students, you're babying your students. And this is my response. You and I as professionals get resources. We get templates, right? We have things to follow. We get samples at work. If I'm doing a speaker contract at school and I've never done that before, administration doesn't expect me to out of the blue just know how to do this, right? Administration will give me a template. So if we get this in a professional setting, why can't we provide that to our students? It's the right thing to do. Avoid high risk assignments where assignments or a few assignments determine a majority of the grade. Abstain from that where like, one assignment is worth like 50% of the grade. Remind students of assignments either verbally, on the email syllabi. Be flexible with assignments and negotiate deadlines. Now, I want to say one thing before I move on to Joy, and then I'm just going to cut it because we ran out of time. These are a lot of tips about being trauma informed, and you don't have to do all of it. Personal info about me, I am 0% flexible with my deadlines across my classes. I make this known to my students the very first day. I really never accept late work unless there's like some situation that they can provide me proof. And I do this because I'm a human being and I need boundaries with work. And if I would allow my students to be flexible, I would be working all day, and I already work all day. So in order for me to be sane, I need to have boundaries with my students, and I cannot negotiate deadlines for me. That's what sits well with my soul. I don't want to burn out. But because I am not flexible at all in the least bit, again, 0, I do a ton of low risk assignments where if students miss an assignment, guess what? It's really not going to impact their grade. I do a ton of extra credit and I do a ton of scaffolding. So I constantly break down assignments. I show them, I model assignments. And I do this because I'm not going to negotiate deadlines. If you don't want to do all that, then you may want to be the kind of professor that negotiates deadlines and allows students to submit second drafts. You need to figure out what's going to work for you. Now, I know I've been speaking quickly. I didn't realize when I did my run through yesterday, I nailed this presentation in 1 hour and 13 minutes. And today that did not happen. So I'm going to talk about joy and then I'm going to cut it. So fostering joy, super important. It can decrease stress and increase feelings of community and belonging. And there are so many ways to foster joy in the classroom. Think about your discipline. Think about your setting. Think about the classes you teach, right? Think about your job, right? Think about what your students respond to. Think about your resources. And again, think about your own bucket. But essentially, keep this question in mind. How can I lighten the mood? How can I fill people's buckets? Imagining that everyone has a bucket, right? What can I do to add to that bucket of joy? And there's a ton of ideas, right? You can joke around with them. You can play a game of cahoots. Maybe you go outside and, one day you go to like the stadium or like the plaza on your campus, your amphitheater, and you teach outside. Maybe you listen to music. You schedule breaks. Maybe you're just a human and you laugh at yourself in front of the class. Maybe you do random acts of kindness and take your students snacks. I usually take donuts or like some kind of snacks to my night classes. Maybe you share positive emotions and create space also for the not so positive emotions. Positive being in quotation. Focus on the process. Maybe, you know, you give your students second chances. Maybe you celebrate the small stuff, right? Maybe they failed their assignment, but guess what? Maybe they submitted an assignment. Woo, woo, right? That's something that's maybe worthy of celebration. Be willing to broaden your definition of success. It's not all about getting A's. Do your students feel connected to? Is their mental health thriving? Are they making friends? Did they get a job? Something, right? Maybe show pictures of animals like this cute little hedgehog I have going on here, right? Remind students that they're valuable, that they're accepted, regardless of the grades that they earn, regardless. You want to build community, you want to build connection. And if you don't do that, you're going to build disconnection. And then I want to just end with this. So hopefully you'll see that one of the ways that I create joy in the classroom is by potlucks, which praying to God we'll eventually be able to come back soon, where I take snacks. And it's such a good way to just be able to bond over food and laugh and just be happy and merry. I love the holidays. I love Valentine's Day. And if Valentine's Day lands on a day that I teach class, I actually do like a whole Valentine's Day party. And in the agenda, I actually tell them that the first thing we need to do to start class is grab a tree. So I'll lay out like carrots and like mozzarella sticks, and you know, and those are just the ways that I build community. Now, I'm sorry I couldn't finish. I am ending with 12 minutes on, you know, left. I definitely want to give some time for you to contribute as well. Thank you for being here with me today. And that's all I got. But otherwise, learn about allyship, ally statements. Um, there's ways to respond to disclosed trauma. There's ways to provide strategies for grounding, not only for our students, but for ourselves. Maybe we'll have another workshop and we'll be able to chat about that. So Carly, maybe you'll be able to invite me back so that we can maybe finish this
Yes,
presentation.
absolutely. Thank you so much. And there are a few questions for you in the chat or in the Q&A section. And for those of you that do have questions for Esther, please use the Q&A option so we don't lose the questions in the chat box. And so are you able to see those?
Yes, I just got him. All right, let's go. And I'm so sorry you can't unmute yourself. It's like just the webinar safety features. I wish, right? We could just kind of be live in the moment. How should we proceed and approach a situation when we feel we can't help someone, yet they only want to share with us? That is such a good question. That's definitely happened to me, and I'm sure it has happened to other people, where students are really apprehensive about talking to someone else. First and foremost, you need to remind students of reporting requirements, especially if they're a minor. We are mandated reporters. So if someone is a child under the age of 18, which we do get under 18, you need to be aware of the reporting requirements and check with admin with that. Maybe some of the mental health counselors can jump on board to supplement my answer. I will say to continue to maintain the relationship with the student, loop in your mental health counselor, let them know that they don't want to share with anyone else, but this is the situation. And you want to make that email connection, that call, because you don't know where that situation might go, if it might escalate or not. Then you want to reestablish faith in the system. So maybe something like, Carly, I know that this happened to you and I know that you're afraid, but please know that we have trained professionals and I'm really close to Larry. I promise, right? I know, no, maybe not I promise. I know he will take care of you, and offer to support them. So let's say Carly doesn't want to go to the mental health center. You know, again, that task avoidance, right? So maybe something that you can say is, Carly, would it help you if I made the appointment with Larry? Would it help you, Carly, if I walked you over? So there are tiny steps that we can take to eventually do that, whether that's reestablishing the faith, you offering to take some of that work off their shoulders. Those are good steps. And I know we have a lot of mental health counselors. So if you want to add to that, please do. Because right off the top of my head, those are the answers that came to me. And I'm so sorry I can't keep up with the chat. There's a lot going on here.
Most of the questions seem to all be in the Q&A. There's
Okay.
not too many questions in the chat.
So again, my mental health counselors, go ahead. But that's what I would say, right? Loop someone in, inform them of requirements, and start planting that seed of you can trust the college, right? And you build relationships so you know who you can send over. All right, question number 2. So I'm gonna end. Can you dismiss that question, Carly? Okay. Question number 2. How do you encourage students to stay positive while avoiding silver linings? I think you have to throw it back at them. You need to, first and foremost, you have to honor pain, man, right? You need to honor it. You need to honor how something is stressful to you. You need to validate first and foremost, right? And I always think of going back to the student and say, well, what do you think, right? What do you think can be helpful in the situation? What are your goals? How do you think you can move forward to that? We're not there to give students answers. We're not here to give anybody answers, right? We're often here to help and to reflect. So I would say to ask them, right, to have them reflect on what their goals are for themselves and what they really want, what they need. And again, mental health counselors, jump on, supplement, add on. And hopefully that is hopefully that will be a departure, a good point of departure. Sandy, I love the create joy section. Yes, I forget that. Yes, I mean, I think I do too. Maybe sometimes I do really wacky extra credit. Like I recently had an extra credit where students had to take a picture of their favorite food or snacks. So people were uploading picture of like pasta and like ice cream, and there was like a whole discussion in the discussion board about food. I also have another extra credit. It's called selfies with pets. And if students don't have a pet, then they get to put a picture of the animal that they one day wish to be a parent of. So they tell me like, oh, one day I want to have a Labradoodle. And, I do all kinds of activities with them. And it's so important to do that because here's the thing, we can't control the world. Even when we have the best intentions, we can't control our student lives. But there's one thing that we can't control, or ish, right? Which is the environment, right? In that moment, we can have semi control of our class. And that's really what we have to hone in and honor. Any other questions?
It looks
Feedback?
like somebody has their hand raised. Hortensia, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I can allow you to talk. I can unmute you if you wanted to chat, if you wanted to talk. I also don't want to unmute you if you're not prepared. So feel free to write in the chat if you'd like. Oh, their hands down. Okay. So I think there's another question that looks like popped up in the Q&A.
How can students help students? This is not an area that I am familiar with. And honestly, this is an area also that I'm cautious with. So the research is interesting. I always go back and I rely on research. Having peers is having peer support system is incredibly powerful for individuals, okay? But one of the reasons why my initial hesitation arises is because sometimes peers are not the best response to students, because sometimes peers are not trained to deal with the situation. But I will say this, I think the one thing that we can do to have student help students is ally trainings. So safety zone trainings, allyship trainings. I think what we can do is give people the tools, but we should always be referring our students to professionals on campus. We should remind them that there's alliances, that there's clubs. So we should encourage collaboration, and we should also encourage trainings, but we need to keep in mind that ultimately individuals, if they need it, they should be seeking professional services. And again, mental health counselors, feel free to unmute if if you want to add to that. Lisa, I think, wants to contribute something. And Carly, just so you know, you're muted.
Thank you. Lisa, can you raise your hand so you pop to the top of the chat list so I can unmute you? Perfect. Okay. Oops. Sorry, Erin. Can you, I'm not seeing you, Lisa. You just went away.
Well, maybe if the participants, or is she there?
Oh, Lisa? There we go.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Yes,
Hi,
thank you.
Lisa.
Hi. I just wanted to share. One day I was in class and I heard my student, it was break time, and he was playing a song, and it was Julio Iglesias. And so I started singing the song and I said, hey now, I said, oh, you're a romantic kind of guy. Who knew? So I just made a joke. And after that, he said, well, I got to be honest, Miss Lejean, I didn't think you would know who Julio Iglesias is. And I said, well, I like Roberto Carlos. He's a little old fashioned, but you kind of young, but your mom would know. And I started naming these singers sing Spanish. And he said, you speak Spanish? I said, no, just the things I learned from you all. I said, but you don't have to know. You could feel the music. And I know music and I love the songs, you know. And after that, he started to speak to me. It was that little connection of music. And this was a guy who, for one, I wouldn't even think he would be listening to Julio Iglesias, maybe Ricky Martin, but not, you know. And so it just went to show you, after that, we would talk about music and he would say, have you heard this? This guy sings. Well, I said, oh, I never heard of him. And then that relationship grew. Something as small as identifying a song brought us a friendship. And he opened up about different things, whereas I don't think we ever made that connection. He just came to class. But that was a great connection that led to other things in his life of him sharing he's not documented or this or his concerns, just that one little thing. I just wanted to share that.
That is so beautiful, Lisa. Hearing, I almost brought me to tears. I have, it's such a passion that you have too with your students, and how beautiful that you were able to make that connection.
Yeah.
One of the things that I do in class is, well, when I, before when I was in class, I would always play different kind of music every week. So sometimes it would be like rock en español, next cumbias, then like mariachi, and then classical. And I rotated the style of music, the genre, every week. And that was actually a very interesting way for students to actually be like, oh, she's hip, she's cool, she's a human. And it would spark conversations with different types of people because eventually I get you. So that was kind of a way. But I agree, music is really powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Lisa.
Great. I think that is all the questions we have. Oh, there's one question that popped up in the chat.
Yes, I am going to send you my email. Yes. And then I will look for it. So what is my email? Okay, there we go. Yeah, so there's my email. You're more than welcome to contact me. I will look, yes, Ruth, I will definitely look for that study. There's a couple, and I should have them saved on my computer.
Wonderful.
So shoot me an email and I'll respond.
Thank you. Well, we are right at time. I wanted to say a big thank you to you, Esther, for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. I think I learned so much, and I think from the chat, it's clear that everyone is so appreciative of you coming and sharing all of this with us today. So thank you, truly. And I look forward to seeing a lot of you at the future trainings. I put my email in the chat if you'd like to receive those registration links. But again, one big thank you to Esther for everything that you shared today. And I look forward to working more with you and offering a part 2 to this training. It's clearly needed.
Yes,
Perfect.
thank you, Carly. I appreciate and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. And I'll hopefully see you around.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.